Honestly, I felt pretty significantly encouraged and excited. And then I was like immediately sort of sheepish about it. And then I read it again and was like, am I missing something? And the second time I read it, I think it clicked. I was like, oh my God, our stuff is in there.
Hello, I'm Guido Girgenti.
And I'm Waleed Shahid.
And you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, featuring the Bloc versus Bloc, congressional confrontations to movements, social movements, youth movements, bringing demands to the negotiating table. Today, Waleed, we actually talk about the exact thing we mentioned in our tagline.
Finally, there's a table?
There's a table. People negotiate at it. It's virtual. I think it happened entirely on Zoom.
If it happened on Zoom, is it really a negotiating table?
I don't know. I guess all political negotiations happen on Zoom. We should ask Amira. But this one definitely happened on Zoom. You know, we foreshadowed this in episode 4. We were like, we're about to get into a legislative fight about infrastructure, the Green New Deal. We didn't know that we'd won Georgia when we recorded episode 4 back in December.
I mean, episode 4 is a good primer for what we just experienced in Texas.
Yeah.
I remember David Wallace Wells really scared the shit out of me. And he was like, some countries might be hit by 6 different natural disasters simultaneously.
Yeah.
And when you see what's happening in Texas, I believe it. I don't think the shit is going to get better. People don't have water. People don't have heat. People don't have electricity.
Yeah, it's a bleak snapshot of what many, many years in the future could look like. But Texas isn't being hit by 6 different natural disasters, and it can really always get worse. This is the worst that it's ever been.
No, but he's saying this is the beginning.
Yes.
And I'm like, this is the beginning?
Yeah.
I feel like it's the end.
It's high stakes. If there's a quote-unquote infrastructure package coming down in the spring, I mean, what's happening in Texas is about the grid. It's about infrastructure. So it's high stakes.
But I still have questions about, if this is how bad it's going to get, like, what are we supposed to do about it? And you talked to Varshini Prakash of the Sunrise Movement today. And one of the things I'm wondering is, are we going to be okay? Did any of the things we've done for the past 2 years, did any of them matter? There was this moment that happened that I don't think gets enough coverage, which is this Biden-Bernie Unity Task Force.
It happened at a weird time.
It's like a blip.
It's May 2020, which is right after the longest month in the history of time, March 2020. And right before one of the biggest uprisings for racial justice and black freedom in this country's history. And in between that, at the end of the Democratic primary, there was this very fascinating policy negotiation that happened that you are referencing.
Yeah, and I feel like Varshini and Sunrise and AOC's participation in that task force is pretty historically unprecedented.
Right. You have not seen this open. We are doing a intra-party factional negotiation.
You don't even have to go back to Bill Clinton. Hillary Clinton didn't do this when she became the nominee.
Biden and Sanders say they're forming task forces to discuss issues like healthcare, immigration, and climate change. The former vice president, of course, still faces a lot of skepticism from younger liberal voters who are wary of the Democratic establishment.
But that news story is never the national news story, because the only time you hear about the Green New Deal in the national news is when the right wing has decided our strategy for the national news cycle today, we're in some scandal, we're scapegoating the Green New Deal. Let's do that. We did that spring 2019. Let's do it again.
If we were in the AOC world, fast forward 10 years and everything is solar, everything is wind. If you don't have power to keep you warm, you're gonna die.
Somehow, a policy that has not passed in the United States is responsible for the power outages in Texas, a state where Republicans have controlled the legislature and the governorship for several decades. Governor Abbott, Ted Cruz, Dan Crenshaw, all these Republicans who are backed by fossil fuel donations are doing what I want to call lies for profit. These people are backed by big oil and dirty utilities we put on an ad calling on Governor Abbott to resign for his lies for profit games that has left Texas's infrastructure woefully unprepared for this crisis. Here it is.
As millions of his constituents went without power, water, and heat amid freezing temperatures, Texas Governor Abbott looked into the camera and spewed lies.
Sean, this shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America.
The truth is, Republicans deregulated and privatized Texas's energy grid to benefit rich oil and utility executives for the last 20 years. Abbott protected his pockets over his constituents. It's time for him to resign, upgrade our infrastructure, and create millions of Green New Deal jobs.
But Guido, is there a plan to deal with what people in Texas are facing today and other people all across the country are facing today?
Yes, I think there is, but it's wonky, which is why the conversation with Varshini today is interesting. There are policies that are in Biden's climate plan that are only there because activists asked them at the task force. And if those policies were to become law, for example, if Joe Biden actually pursues a plan of achieving net zero carbon emissions from the entire power sector, the entire energy sector by 2035, which would be a huge mobilization. In that America, what's happening in Texas wouldn't be possible. I called up Evan Weber, Sunrise's political director, to confirm. Here's what he told me.
If we were to move to 100% clean energy by 2035, like Joe Biden has promised, we would have an entirely different power system and electric grid in this country, which would make the events of the past week in Texas essentially impossible. The reason for that is that in order to reach that target, we would have to build out a bunch more renewable energy. To build out more renewable energy and have it operate on the grid, we would also have to add a lot of storage to the grid, and we'd also have to connect it to other parts of the country. Right now, a big part of Texas' unique failure this past week was because their electrical grid is in fact isolated from the rest of the country. So all of the changes that Joe Biden is talking about in his climate plan would actually make the Texas freeze or the Texas blackout impossible and not happen in the future.
But how much of that was due to Sunrise?
Well, this is why the conversation with Varshini is so interesting, because hearing her experience of walking into the Biden-Bernie Unity Task Force, the way in which the Green New Deal had already shifted the terms of the debate allowed them, I think, to win more than they were expecting in some ways. And there's a conversation to be had, and we get a little into it, about what's lacking in this first round of Green New Deal policies that are in Build Back Better. But what's in there, this trio of standards, clean energy standards, big public investments, and a commitment to justice. Standards, investments, and justice. You see how a consensus around those Green New Deal type policies just shifts the whole center of gravity. Sunrise was very antagonistic with Biden, right? Like, Biden had a climate plan that did not have a lot of the policies that we're going to talk about today. That was just his first climate plan in the Democratic primary in fall 2019. And Sunrise gave him an F. Sunrise was like, you get a failing grade on your climate plan in their policy scorecard. And then they endorsed Bernie, and then Bernie lost. And I think Varshini is like, right, I'm kind of bracing to be disappointed. So I think you do hear some tone of surprise in realizing just how much the debate had changed.
Out of those task forces, climate is the place where Biden improves his plan the most. And that is because I think Sunrise and AOC and the Green New Deal movement was able to accumulate the most people power, political power, and then push at that table for even bigger and bolder stuff. And it's not everything. They didn't get everything.
What I love about talking to Varshini is that every time we talk, she'll tell me about the policy weeds, but she's also always open to just share her reflections on her own leadership and be honest and remind us that she's a person. She's someone who has to show up at these task force meetings and sit there for hours, that has to prep, that has to be the face of this movement, that has to repeat this message. And it's just always...
I wonder what the icebreakers are like.
Right, Ted has to do the icebreakers with John Kerry and then go speak to students and then go try to organize a rally. And it's rare for activists to get as far into party politics and as far into national politics as Sunrise and Varshini has. And it's just a privilege to listen to her, I think, in this moment, reflect on not just politics, but her leadership, her life, what's coming next, how the movement is going to need to change, and react to this victory, which is a partial victory, as all victories are going to be on climate change right now, but not allowing that to lead one into despair and instead saying, what have we won, what have we not won, what do we do well, what do we not do well? All right, here's Varshini Prakash of the Sunrise Movement. Good morning, Varshini.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good.
Varshini, it's the beginning of 2021. 2 years have passed since the AOC sit-in. When we worked together in the divestment movement, I used to tell student activists this quote from Obama's campaign manager, David Axelrod. Quote, only when the campaign staff and the reporters have become physically ill, Varshini, over the repetition of the message, only then have you begun to penetrate the public consciousness. I'm wondering at what point in the last 2 years you became physically nauseous over the repetition of a message about the Green New Deal.
Oh, man. Was there just one? I think there might have been a few. I mean, sometime last year, the combination of having to say it on the internet all the time because we were just in the throes of COVID, I wasn't saying it to actual people and just like getting excited again about the vision of what we were talking about.
You have to summon the fear of climate change over Zoom every day.
Yeah, exactly. I was just like, oh my God. There was 1 week where I think I spoke to 20 reporters. And there was a moment when I was just so exhausted from saying the same damn thing again and again and again to all these reporters that I literally forgot my own personal story. Like someone was like, tell me how you got into this movement. And I was like, I think I'm Indian. And
You're like, I'm sorry, I really prepped for the task force policy recommendations, and I haven't thought about myself in a while.
I was just like, I just couldn't say it again. You know, I couldn't muster the energy to be like, this is why I care about the climate crisis. I was so exhausted at that point. And after that, I took multiple weeks off and was like, I can't do this. But yeah, that was one of the moments. That was my favorite trainings that you did, Guido. I really took that training to heart.
I can tell because you became physically ill. But perhaps all of this nausea has paid off because the last Wednesday of January was Climate Day. President Joe Biden announced a slew of executive orders.
When I think of climate change, I think of, and the answers to it, I think of jobs. A key plank of our Build Back Better recovery plan is building a modern, resilient climate infrastructure and clean energy future that will create millions of good-paying union jobs.
How did you feel on Climate Day? You've been nauseous many moments in the past 2 years telling people to do this, and then you saw a newly inaugurated president say all these things.
Yeah. Honestly, I felt pretty significantly encouraged and excited. And then I was like immediately sort of sheepish about it. Like, and then I read it again and was like, am I missing something? And the second time I read it, I think it clicked. I was like, oh my God, our stuff is in there. Oh my God, this is like the language that we talked about on this task force. I think in that first week, at least, Biden had included more from the movement than I think Obama was able to do during his entire tenure. It was pretty monumental. And I think at the very least had cemented this idea that climate was going to be central to the Democratic Party and to American politics. And I think in that moment, I just had a feeling of, like, we won. We won. Like 3 years ago, we set out this campaign to make climate justice matter in American politics. That was literally what we said when we launched. And I think we actually won that campaign in a lot of ways.
You mentioned you're watching him say language that you had negotiated into his plans through the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force.
Yeah.
So just to go back in time and tell that story, after the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign, which Sunrise had endorsed, is no longer playing to win in the spring of 2020, it's clear Joe Biden is going to take it. At some point, you, AOC, and then more establishment figures from the Democratic Party who've worked on climate change for their whole careers, John Kerry, Gina McCarthy, you are invited to participate on this Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force.
I am. Yes.
What is a Unity Task Force? Like, what was it?
Well, okay, I didn't know what a Unity Task Force was, I will say, going in. Because
I think it's a new body in American politics. They're like, we don't know how to resolve the left liberal tension in the primary. We're just going to create something called the Unity Task Force.
Exactly. I mean, it wasn't the worst thing. At least on our task force, I think it worked out because I think
Which was
of the
the climate task force.
The climate one, yeah. We had 6 weeks. There were 3 Bernie people, 5 Biden people, Biden basically appointees on each task force, and we had 6 weeks to bring all of the policy ideas from all of the different parts of the Democratic Party together and emerge with some set of, well, unity policies, like debate, negotiate, and come away with something that was ultimately going to inform the platform of the Democratic National Committee later that summer, that would get voted in as the official Democratic stance and inform the presidential policies of the Biden administration. The first day that I get into this task force, it's on Zoom, which I was sort of grateful for because I feel like sometimes Zoom is like the great equalizer.
John Kerry in person is he's very charismatic, he's very tall.
He's very tall, and I was like, on Zoom, we're all the same height. As a 5-foot-tall brown woman, it's kind of nice to all be the same height on Zoom, John Kerry, Gina McCarthy, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Don McEachin, Representative Kathy, I'm just in a Zoom call with Congress people and former secretaries of state and EPA administrators and one of the most powerful and visible figures of the progressive left. And I'm just like, hey guys.
Hi, I'm from Boston.
Hi, I'm Indian. I'm from Boston.
Why do you care about climate change, Varshini? I can't remember at this point.
And it's just this wild moment. And I was never sure that it was going to be a valuable or productive process, to be totally honest, but I had an inkling because I knew that Kerry, even though he was chummy with Biden and, Gina, who had worked in the Obama administration, I had a feeling from day one we were having a completely different conversation than what would have happened in the Obama administration. We got into that call. The first thing that John Kerry does after he and AOC do their introductions is turn it over to me and ask me, as the youngest person on the task force, the vision that I want to see and the end result of where we want to end up as a team.
Wow.
Then we have a conversation about sort of the parameters of the debate that we're going to have. And the first things that people say are, we need to have benchmarks that are far more aggressive than any kind of 2050 timeline.
Someone else says that. You don't say that.
John Kerry said that, yes. We need to make sure that labor, this is Kathy Castor, we need to make sure that labor is front and center of any fight to stop the climate crisis and make sure that this is an effort to create good union jobs.
Kathy Castor is
She's the chairwoman of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis.
Right.
Yeah, and then they're like, we need to make sure that environmental justice and equality is a central part of all of our efforts as well. This is Catherine Flowers, Don McEachin. Everybody actually said it. And then we're talking about this can't be a conversation about carbon taxes and regressive policies. This needs to be about massive investments to basically build out a new economy. And everyone was like, yep. Like everybody was just on the tip.
I love that.
Everybody was just, in many ways, like on the same page, And the degree of that, I don't want to overblow it, but I think I had gone in expecting a conversation about like carbon markets and cap and trade and things like that are sort of outdated. The gravity of the conversation around climate has just like moved past that, but a lot of politicians have not. But to see this group of people really embracing the standards, investments, justice framework that has become the centerpiece of the climate policy debate, I think buttressed by things like the Green New Deal, was just a completely different starting place than I was expecting.
I'm so happy you brought up this point because it's a dynamic that I wanted to ask you about, which is that after Joe Biden releases these executive orders or this task force releases its recommendations, people will ask, okay, Varshini, is that the Green New Deal? And it's sort of like, well, Green New Deal's a very big vision. We could talk about what's missing. But when you say people are on the same page or people are on the same tip, to me, that is the victory of the Green New Deal. Because before the Green New Deal, it's exactly what you're saying. You're like, I'm going to show up at an establishment meeting to talk climate policy. And what's going to happen is the establishment folks are going to push market-based solutions, and I'm going to need to push a government-led transformation of the economy to decarbonize fast enough. And that's going to seem radical. And even though establishment folks have not embraced the Green New Deal as a brand, I feel like the core insight of the Green New Deal, which is you need the government to decarbonize the economy fast enough, and you need the government to protect people and make it a humane transition as you're doing that. That insight is so true that it's created the space for this new policy consensus to take shape, which I think you mentioned, which is a policy consensus of using standards, setting standards across economic sectors, doing massive investment, and making an upfront commitment to justice. Standards, investment, and justice. Those are Green New Deal policies. It's not the whole Green New Deal, but the terms of the debate, even in that task force, are being set by the Green New Deal. Is that wrong to say?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it goes to show why the importance of a vision is, why we need a vision in politics. I think when the Green New Deal first came out, people were like, what is this? This is just a 14-page resolution. It doesn't matter. It's not real legislation. I remember like one prominent reporter being like, I haven't read the Green New Deal resolution, but is it a carbon tax? And I was like, what? I think you're really missing what's going on
Spoiler
here.
alert, no.
I was like, yikes. But it's this vision of the totality of the urgent mobilization that needs to occur to combat the climate crisis without leaving anyone behind. So it's the North Star. It's the thing that encompasses all the many little policies and shifts. It's the thing that allows us to see, are we making progress towards the ultimate victory that protects life on this earth? And are we on the right track? And also allows us to claim victory as we go. Before we had this vision, it was like trying to fight one pipeline by pipeline. It was like
one carbon tax at a time, telling people that the tax is not going to be enough.
Exactly, and consistently on the defense, rather than being able to say, no, this is the proactive vision, and framing the entire terms of the debate. It's not like the Green New Deal was the first time that somebody had come up with a vision for how to address the climate crisis. Like, that has existed in many communities for a long time. This isn't anything new. It just was penetrating the national conversation.
I want to make this concrete for folks because I think people hear this a lot from activists, which is, well, having a vision is so important. You need to set the terms of the debate, and then that is going to allow us to hash out the policy details on our terms. And I think people hear that and they're like, well, did it really happen? Did you really get to hash out the policy details? And you did. You did.
Yeah.
So I want to hear about that. So you mentioned the Green New Deal resolution, right?
Yep.
It's 14 pages long. It sets out a government-led transformation of the economy. In terms of government leading a transformation, you look at Biden's 2019 climate plan, there's no proposals to create new government agencies to lead this. By the time the Unity Task Force recommendations come out on climate, it says create an Office of Climate Mobilization. And then you get to the executive orders. Now we actually have a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy,
Heyo.
which is staffed by an Inslee climate policy advisor. So we went from nothing in the plan to a recommendation out of the task force to having an office now.
It happened. Yes, we debated this for a really long time in the task force, and people were like, I don't know, this seems kind of extra, unclear if we actually need this, but it ended up being our top line priority. And I think it's not just the insider politics, it's also the movement energy. First of all, we had supportive individuals on the task force like Gina and John and other people who were like, yes, this is a good idea, but we're not sure what formation this should look like. Just put it in the recommendations. We'll deal with it later. So it got in the door. Then Office of Climate Mobilization becomes the major demand that we're utilizing from a communications perspective for the rest of 2020 after the task force. The time between November and January, one of the top things that we are saying is establish an Office of Climate Mobilization. I also got sick of that. I was like on NPR, I was on all these,
multiple rounds
my
of
God,
nausea
like,
to get a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy.
Exactly. Like I said Office of Climate Mobilization so many goddamn times that month. But, you've got to get this surround sound effect, hearing it from the movement, hearing it from the press.
See, Varshini, you know that you haven't won until you've won. So even when you get the office mentioned in the Unity Task Force, you're like, still got to go out there and make myself nauseous demanding it.
Oh, hell yeah.
Because it's not real yet. In Biden's climate plan from the primary, he says he'll create a new class of well-paying jobs and job training around climate-resilient industries. But there isn't really any mention of a federal jobs program. By the time you get out of the Unity Task Force, you've gotten in this language: mobilize the next generation of workers, a new corps, and then in the executive orders, the order calls for the establishment of a civilian climate corps initiative to put a new generation of Americans to work. So you go from no federal jobs program to CCC, Civilian Climate Corps, a callback to the New Deal.
It's true. And, okay, you know what's weird about these? Like, I'm trying to think of stories. I was like, where was the conflict in this? Was there really any conflict? And a lot of them did not have any conflict. Like, I was like, hey, this is a priority for us. We really need to see it in there. And,
they're
AOC
like, we
was
love
really excited about
a
it.
civilian conservation.
Literally. They were just like, this is dope. I love it. Let's put it in.
Maybe because you'd already won on the Green New Deal. Like, once people are thinking about it in those terms, they're like, yeah, throw a jobs program in there.
Yeah, and I think, with the economy, with the pandemic, I think Biden's already thinking in a different way.
Because this
He's
was summer
already
2020.
saying, exactly. He's already saying FDR-style government approach, whatever he said. It's very in alignment with the way that we've been talking, right? Green New Deal, the New Deal part of that is, we need a decade or more of policy making that is going to employ millions upon millions of people to avert catastrophe.
Wow. Another one. Biden's climate plan was $1.7 trillion in the primary. There was no price tag mentioned in the Unity Task Force, but the Build Back Better climate plan of the general, and I think what we're expecting to be the basis for the infrastructure plan coming this spring, is a $2 trillion price tag. But attached to that is where the investment is going to go. Because in the plan from the primary, Biden says he'll make it a priority for agencies to do community-driven approaches, to make sure that environmental justice is prioritized. But when you come out of the task force, much more specifically, you've got set a goal that disadvantaged communities receive 40% of the overall benefits of spending. And this 40% of investment going to front lines has made it then all the way into the executive order.
Yes.
How did that 40% investment to the front lines get in there?
Well, we asked for it. Like, literally, I'm trying to come up with, dramatic stories for how this went down. We literally were like, these are our priorities. Here's like 15 pages of it. Take this. And we went through it line item by line item. And we were like, we need it to be 40%. There's precedent for it in New York State. They were just with it. And I didn't, honestly, I did not expect for that to end up in the final version. Like, I didn't absolutely thought we would be in an entrenched fight for the next 3 years. And I still think it's going to be complicated. I'm curious if we'll actually see the 40% and how easy it will be to produce that. But I think this is what happens when the policy consensus is built to a much greater degree, where you've got actually like big greens, environmental justice organizations, political organizations, racial justice organizations. You've got an entire network and constellation of movement organizations, as well as politicians, as well as like the policy. Yeah, like in many ways, Biden is a weather vane for where the political climate actually is. And I think we're seeing some of that as well.
And then lastly, ambition on the timelines, which you mentioned. So they scrapped 2050 at the beginning. The Green New Deal has a sector-by-sector approach, which is we need all the sectors to get to net zero emissions, and you need to set standards, and you need to invest in all of them.
Right, and what we mean by sectors is like power, agriculture, transportation, housing, like that. Yeah.
Right. You come out of the Unity Task Force with the most ambitious goal ever set by a major politician for the power sector, which is completely eliminating carbon pollution and getting to net zero for the power sector by 2035, and that goal is still in the executive orders.
It is, yeah. This was kind of wild because obviously a 2050 deadline around power was just absolutely unacceptable. And the Green New Deal was focused on a 2030 timeline. So we were like, okay, we need to get to carbon neutrality by 2030. And they were like, 2035. We were like, 2030. And they were like, 35. And we conferred a bit, and we were like, you know what?
This was like six
good.
Zoom calls later. 2030. 2035.
But ultimately, I was like, wow, to go from 2050 to 2035 and have that be the floor for the President of the United States of America was pretty impressive. I was actually kind of amazed. I thought that was going to be a much bigger fight, in large part because that means the president has a lot of pressure to deliver during his tenure. You don't get to a 2035 number.
That means you got to move quick.
You got to move like right now.
Right. So just to zoom out, we're talking in February 2021 after this big climate announcement, but before this ultimate fight over Biden's recovery package. I'm sure we'll talk more about that this spring, but as I was preparing for this interview, thinking about the time we spent together, I was like, I'm going to talk to Varshini about all these things that she got out of the Unity Task Force, but the truth is that Varshini's always been a winner.
Oh, thanks, Guido.
No, I'm serious.
So
when
nice.
we were divestment activists, it was almost competitive. It's like, who's going to get their university to divest the endowment from
that is not
fossil
how
fuel
I felt.
stocks? I know. Well, you are a better person than me, but and you won. You got the University of Massachusetts to divest, and you just said, we got the Office of Climate Mobilization in there, but I didn't care. I went on TV. And I was like, man, she's always playing to win. She knows that she hasn't won until she's won, and she's always playing to win. I'm just wondering if you could go back to Varshini in that moment of winning divestment, winning the University of Massachusetts, divesting its endowment from fossil fuels, and ask that Varshini, wow, you just won. How do you make change? Like, tell us what it takes to win on climate change, given that. And now I could ask you, wow, you negotiated all these wins in the task force, you built this movement, and then you took the power of that movement and you extracted concessions. How does change happen? How do we win on climate change? And you would give me an answer now. And I'm wondering, what do you think has changed most in the answer that you would give between then and now?
That's a good question. The funny thing is so many of the things are actually the same. The things I'm thinking of are being grounded in the stakes of what you're fighting for, having a vision of what victory looks like, and then having a relentless, tenacious fight and an unwillingness to accept defeat, a real belief in the power of ordinary people, a deep investment in a team and building relationships that are rock solid, that are vulnerable, that are compassionate, that are strategically aligned, and investing in that culture. And I think the things that would be different are, I think 4 years ago, we had all been like organizing in private institutions to revoke the social license of the fossil fuel industry to act and cast them as bad actors. And that was amazing. I owe so much of my initial development to the divestment movement. And I think the ability to then take that and apply it to the centers of power in American politics, like literally apply it to politics and media and institutions that direct and govern our society, and to engage with power directly, was something that I knew theoretically, and now I feel like I know it very concretely. And it is true.
What is true?
It is true that to win, you have to engage with power directly. And I don't mean that's just like sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office. It's not that literal. It's just like we were missing this whole piece of the fact that the greatest tool that we have at our disposal to create massive levels of economic and social change was the government, and we weren't utilizing it at all. Meanwhile, the right's worldview had just subsumed American politics.
I wonder what has changed in the answer you would give about how to win on climate change, maybe in just the past year then, because I think, as you're saying, what would have changed is this understanding of politics, party politics, and the media, even as the power you're wielding is still coming from the grassroots.
Yeah.
But as you're saying, that was something you might have said to me 2 years ago, but at that point it was theoretical. It was like, theoretically, we're going to sit in at Nancy Pelosi's office. That's going to build us some power, and I'm going to use that. But I have no idea what that's going to be like.
Yep.
Now you have experienced it concretely.
Yeah.
Has your understanding of how to win shifted or sharpened after the concrete experience of having grassroots power to wield and then wielding it in reality in Zoom?
Yeah. I would say yes. And I think in the last 3 years, what has happened is a pretty tremendous narrative shift in the country around the scope, the scale, the nature of the climate crisis and its solutions. And in many ways, what Sunrise has done and the climate strikes and things like that have done is put the nail in the coffin of the, is climate change real debate, and really solidified the sense of the climate crisis is happening, what do we need to do about it, and forced a debate about the solutions.
What is your plan?
Exactly. And Sunrise, at least I'll speak for Sunrise, I think has done a good job of mobilizing individuals who primarily agree with us, are freaked out about the climate crisis, and ready to do something about it. Now where we need to go is not just mobilization, but is in deeper organizing. We have shifted the narrative, but that doesn't mean that we are destined to win. And just because Joe Biden feels like he has a mandate doesn't necessarily mean that he will deliver on that mandate or whatever it is, down the road. And so I think where we need to turn now is, what does it mean to have deep leadership of young people and a deep level of investment in those leaders to actually determine strategies for themselves in their states, the capacity to actually escalate further through strikes.
I know that both of us look back at movement history to try to learn about how we win today, and I know that you've said to me many times, you look back at the New Deal, at abolition, at the Civil Rights Movement, you see a moment where thousands, tens of thousands of people engage in civil disobedience, like thousands of people filling the jails in the Birmingham 1963 campaign. Over 1 million workers go on strike just in the year 1934. And as we've just talked as friends in the past few months, I've noticed this in your thinking where it's like, on the one hand, it's amazing that challenging Democrats in primaries and organizing these sit-ins and bird-dogging politicians, we moved the entire center of gravity of U.S. climate politics. Over the next decade, if we're going to then go beyond that, we probably need a strategy that's also going beyond what we've achieved. And the question you're asking yourself is specifically, in terms of mobilization, non-cooperation, strikes, civil disobedience, how do we develop an organization and leaders that can pull something like that off?
I think that's right. And I think at the heart of that question is also like, what is the spiritual core of the movement that allows you to do that allows you to take great risk, that allows you to pose as a real credible threat to power? There's something in the soul of Sunrise that needs to undergo a transformation over the next few years.
Wow.
And I don't know how to do that exactly. So if anybody's out there listening and knows how to do some soul transformations, let me know.
You're talking about the soul of this organization you've spent at least 5 years thinking about. Maybe a place to start would be just to ask about you. What questions you're grappling with around yourself and your own leadership? Maybe questions you don't have the answer to about where you go and where your leadership goes as you move alongside this organization that will need to grow and will need to transform.
Yeah. Whew, good question. I think I asked myself the question, how deeply do I love the world, and can I love it more deeply today? In the hopes that my love for the world will overcome whatever fears I have about what I need to do. And I don't have the answer to that. Something I'm trying to figure out. It's not really a political question. The capacity to be both vulnerable but also strong. And that is always really hard because the role that I'm in, which no one told me about 3 years ago, and they were like, "Hey, Varsh, want to do this role?" Turns out it's pretty hard to be an executive director, especially when that organization is constantly molting and like shedding old skins and emerging new. The majority of the questions that take up my time that are not just political questions are just, who do I want to be? Like, what kind of leader am I? I've always had a little bit of a fear of getting so entangled in the politics that I just can't find myself again, because it is so transactional, so just devoid of human experience frequently. Yeah, I worry about Congress people. I'm like, damn, it's rough in there.
You meet them and you're like, I don't know if you're doing okay.
Definitely not doing okay. And there's no, they're not supported in that. It's difficult. In my spiritual practice, I feel like what I have learned is that every moment that you are alive is an opportunity to be growing. And so it doesn't matter what room you're in. You're in a room with John Kerry. You're in a room with, a 16-year-old volunteer leader. You're in a room with your, high-level staff. Like, whoever you are in a room with is an opportunity to practice, bring, humility and vulnerability and strength and dignity in that entire, and groundedness in that. And I'm not always perfect. God knows, like, there's definitely many days that the stress of it gets to me, or I'm snippy or whatever, but that's my goal, is like to not get consumed by the politics, but to use it as a way to actually like deepen my own understanding of myself and my humanity.
Varshini Prakash, thank you so much for your leadership and for joining us on Bloc Party.
Thanks for having me, Guido. So fun.
Thank you so much to Varshini Prakash for joining us on Bloc Party. I'm here with our producer, Becca Rose, right after the interview, closing out this week's episode. Becca, I feel like it's rare we get to talk to someone where in one interview they tell us about negotiating with John Kerry and then also tell us about the spiritual questions you need to ask yourself to get through the movement. What did you think?
We're not destined to win, as Varshini says, just because we've gotten this far, and there's still a lot of organizing to be done, but it's really refreshing to be reminded that, like, the left isn't just online. I personally am really inspired by her activism that is rooted in this radical love. And after this conversation, I'm just like, I'm ready to strike, you know? Send me to jail for the climate movement. I'm ready to throw down.
Wow. Well, I guess that means Varshini's good at her job. It sounded like Varshini was quite good at her job when I was asking her about what they were able to get into the Unity Task Force recommendations. And she was like, well, we started out the meeting with the whole center of gravity on the policy having shifted. I did speak to Evan Weber, the political director at Sunrise Movement, on some of the conflicts that went down.
We didn't win all of the fights that we set out to win in the task force. One really notable one, transportation, of which vehicles, the cars that many Americans drive around on the road, make up a really large portion.
You would like to ban the internal combustion engine.
Yeah, that is basically our position. Gas cars are the way of the past. Electric vehicles and alternative forms of transportation are the future. And lots of major corporations like Uber, Lyft, major utilities all agree that we can get to 100% electric vehicles easily by 2030. So this is actually a pretty conservative position.
But Joe Biden doesn't agree.
But Joe Biden isn't there yet. Joe Biden doesn't have a position on this yet. That is the work that the White House is beginning now, and it's up to activists to put on the pressure to make sure that they are having a really ambitious target, like 100% all new electric vehicles by 2030, or even earlier, like 2025.
I'm sure that over the next few months, we will talk to Sunrise again as Biden's infrastructure package develops. Next week, he'll be giving a State of the Union where he's expected to talk more about Build Back Better, and I know that Varshini will be anxious to see how climate is talked about in that address. But then that legislative window will close at some point. We'll go into 2022, and maybe we'll hear from Varshini again about where her questions have taken her.
If the next stage of the climate movement is thinking about deeper organizing, then I think these are really critical questions to be thinking about, because that means the next stage is all about building relationships that are really deeply rooted and meaningful. And I think it'll take a lot of that self-reflection that it seems like Varshini is already doing to get to that point, which is amazing.
Well, we look forward to hearing from Varshini again on those difficult questions as we move into the decade of the Green New Deal. But before then, we will probably be hearing more about the politics, discussing the State of the Union and the infrastructure package to come. Becca, thank you again.
Thank you, Guido.
Thank you to everyone who's listening. Our producer, you've just heard Becca Rose.
Hello.
For the first time. Our mix engineer is Leslie Gaston-Bird. Special thank you, as always, to Amy Westervelt and Michael Catano. See you on the block.
See you on the block.